Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade. And now we're up to Symphony number 24. You know, I listen to these symphonies, and I keep thinking to myself, we're going to hear one that's kind of a dud, that doesn't have something interesting, and so far it hasn't happened. And I suspect at this point that it probably never will. But Symphony number 24 has some absolutely amazing features, especially in its first movement, and I'm going to take a slightly different approach in discussing this symphony. I just want to play you the entire first movement straight through, right up front. Just listen to it, and then we're going to make a really deep dive into some of its special features because they are so remarkable and they tell us so much about the style of classical music. Some elements that are applicable to anything that you're going to listen to by any other composer of this period. So we're going to take some real time and dig into it. So get ready. Here's the entire first movement, no repeats, straight through. Go! Catchy, jocular, kind of fun sounding, isn't it? Now, what is the first thing you notice about this symphony? The first thing is that the main theme is played by the oboes and the horns. It's not given to the strings. That in itself is somewhat remarkable. We heard something similar in Haydn's Philosopher Symphony, though that was probably written somewhat later. We don't really know the chronology of all these pieces, but the fact of the matter is that beginning a symphony with something other than the string section was kind of a new thing. And right away it announces Haydn's intentions to write pieces for the full orchestra and a certain emphasis on the wind section, which will turn out to be prescient, as you will hear anon. But this first movement has got some amazing things going on in it. And now let's figure out what some of them are. However catchy that first subject is, you may have noticed that it's really the only serious tune in the exposition. That first subject is unforgettable. Dum ba da da dum ba da da dum ba. It's so catchy. It's absolutely amazing and kind of leisurely and jocular and friendly and warm and kind of fuzzy. It's a lovely, lovely tune. The second subject may be a little harder to pinpoint, but it's even more important. And it goes to show that when it comes to the classical symphony, it's not always the main catchy tune that is the most important thing. The second subject isn't a theme at all. It's a thing. It's a musical object. In this case, the musical object in question, at least the first part of it actually has two parts, but we're going to be concerned right now with just the first part of it. The first part of it is simply sustained chords with a 4-note ostinato under it. So you hold a chord, and all you got to do is count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it does it again. 1, 2, 3, 4. And it does this a few times, so you get it into your head. Here is the second subject. Simple as can be, and you'd be perfectly justified in forgetting it. But that second subject is going to become the source of the most remarkable passage in the entire symphony, because in the development section, it turns into this hurricane of a harmonic sequence. Now, a sequence is what it sounds like. It's a sequence. It's a repeated little module that's repeated in different harmonic positions up and down the scale. And the sequence in this case is absolutely amazing, because what it does is it completely obliterates your sense of where you are. The development section becomes completely a source of musical turmoil. I'm going to play you the sequence that's clearly based on this second subject. You hear in the background the sustained chords, but in front, those 4-note 1, 2, 3, 4, except it's at double speed. Dot, 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 like that. 1, 2, 3, 4. And here is the sequence in question. I'll put the little thing up so you don't have to stare at me this time. Here is the sequence in the development section. Now, did you notice how that particular sequence of harmonies, it goes so far afield that you really lose track of where the music might be going? It could go on forever. There's no indication of what's going to make it stop or why it's doing what it's doing or how long it's going to do it for, until finally there seems to be hope on the horizon and Haydn pulls up in the form of a full stop. And so asking us to guess, basically, because there's a pause, what's going to happen next after that full stop. And that's the amazing thing. I'm going to now play you the entire development section, because you got to hear the entire development section, and then I have put together what you think is going to happen next, not what Haydn actually does. So here is the entire fake development section. It's all what Haydn wrote up to the point of the recapitulation, where I have stuck in what we think is the logical continuation. Listen to this. Right. We expect the first theme of the symphony, the opening, to simply return. That's what all of this hubbub has been leading up to, right? Wrong. That's not what Haydn does. What Haydn does is totally different. He presents the first theme in what's called the tonic minor. That is, it is the home key, which I think in this case is D major, but in the minor version of it, that is D minor. And it isn't until we get back to that happy-go-lucky second subject, the sustained chords under the four-note ostinato, that we actually reach the home key. So here's what Haydn really does up until that moment when the second subject returns. So here it is. Now, I play this for you so many times because in order to get the full impact of it, you have to hear the long-term trajectory of the music. You can't do it in tiny little sniglets because harmonic approaches to form, in this case sonata form, depends on the time factor. It depends on how long you spend in certain keys and how they relate to each other. And all of that is going to have an impact on your perception of what the music does down the line. It creates certain expectations in you as the listener. And those expectations are hardwired into the way we hear things. They can be entirely subconscious. And what you'll notice that when Haydn does what he does, and does it in the minor, it's a shock. It's a shock. It's obviously the first tune, but it's obviously not the version we're used to. And what that tells us about sonata form is that you may have read or heard in your textbooks that sonata form movements are dramatic. They're dynamic. Things happen. And this is a symphony that absolutely illustrates that. It's cause and effect. You have a tune that's totally memorable. It's the only real serious tune in the entire first movement. So you can't forget it. But when it comes back, it sounds so totally different. So completely different. But why does it sound different? Because after that huge sequence of disruptive harmony, that disorienting passage, and you think, oh, well, okay, fine, we're back home. But no, it's like waking up with a hangover. It's recognizably the same person, but it doesn't feel the same. It has a reaction to the development section. And this development section has been so chaotic that the tune can't find its bearings. And so it remains to our marvelous second subject, that innocuous little sustained chords and four-note ostinato, to rise to the occasion and pull the harmony back home. And so this, too, is a character. And its character has changed over the course of the movement. And now I'm going to play you the second subject as we first hear it and how we hear it in the recapitulation. First, rather lazy and kind of, inoffensive, but then triumphant and happy. And it's the hero of this particular movement. Here they are, one after the other. See what I mean? So this is a sonata movement par excellence. We hear two things. First of all, the evolution of character. You have that second subject first, then you hear its crazy development version, then you hear its happy, triumphant version in the recap, and then you have the first subject, that wonderful, sort of absolutely confident, positive, happy tune in horns and oboes, and then it returns as a tentative, questioning, pensive, oh my God, what have I done? What did I do the night before? Who did I sleep with? Oh my God, right? And so the second subject bails us out and has the movement end triumphantly. And the thing to keep in mind also, the second big point is not just that the characters evolve, but that this evolution continues all the way through the movement. You don't know how it's going to end until it ends, until you actually hear what happens. And that's incredibly important because the textbook view of sonata form says, well, you hear all the themes in their complementary keys in this first part called the exposition. Then you have a development, which develops all the themes and does things to them. And then they all come back in the home key, happy and snuggly and exactly as we first heard them. But that's wrong. That's totally wrong. That isn't what happens. What happens is the development and evolution of these themes as characters continues throughout the entire movement. And you could argue that the most significant development of the first theme only happens at the recapitulation, not in the development section, even though it leads off the development section. Because Haydn's characters are always reacting and responding spontaneously, seeming, to what has happened to a sequence of events. And that sequence of events may have an underlying logic, but the reaction of these characters is unpredictable. It's surprising. And it's the surprising aspect of sonata form that always gets played down in descriptions of form because they have to fit into a mold. But this movement is perfect in terms of its application of sonata form, and it fits no mold. It creates itself as it goes, because the emotional, the expressive response of each of these characters is based logically and inevitably on the prior events. And that's why it's so marvelous. I think it's incredible. And this is the movement that they ought to be using, like to teach sonata form, to teach the potential of sonata form, because Haydn realizes it here in a particularly telling and easy to hear way. And so I'm going to play you the entire first movement again. I told you, you cannot listen to this stuff enough. You really can't. So we're going to play the whole thing straight through again with no repeats so we can reassemble all of the different pieces we've been playing with. And I want you to just listen to it now, completely fresh, but knowing what we now know. And you will, I think, have an entirely different perception from the point at which you first heard it. See if I'm right. I don't know. I just love this stuff. I could listen to it over and over again forever. So I'm going to inflict it on you too. Here you go. astounding. It's astounding music. It's so fascinating to hear. And, somebody wrote a comment just very recently about, me liking to talk about form and having to say, well, you can be sort of like a pinhead intellectual and talk about form, or you can only care about expression, what the music expresses. I think that is a completely false dichotomy, because the expression is the form. The music expresses itself through the form, and the form is dictated by the expression. They are inseparably linked. They're absolutely inseparably linked. And I think it's fascinating to hear how they relate to each other, how one determines the other, and how they interact. It's not a zero-sum proposition or an either-or thing. By understanding the form, you come to understand the expression. It sounds more inevitable. It sounds deeper. It sounds more intense if you have appreciated the form. And you appreciate the form just by listening to it. I don't have to tell you what it is. You hear it. When something it creates an impact, when it has an impact on you, it's the form that's having the impact. That's what's motivating the expression. You don't hear one thing or another. You hear everything all the time. That's my point. I don't want to belabor it too badly, but that's why I think this stuff is so interesting. And simply verbalizing it or talking about it or taking it apart, that doesn't diminish it, and that doesn't change the focus from what the music expresses to how the music expresses it. Those things are always the focus, both of them, always, all the time. So that's the first movement. Now the rest of the symphony, after this incredibly sophisticated and intense first movement, is rather lighter and easier to take, which is the way classical forms generally work. The most complex and sophisticated one comes first when you're fresh and raring to go, and then you get rewarded. You get rewarded by having an opportunity to simply relax, sit back, and take in the sunshine. And the sunshine in this particular symphony comes in the form of a second movement, which is an aria from a wannabe flute concerto. It's simply for flute and strings, solo flute. And as you may have heard at the beginning of the first movement, woodwinds matter in this symphony. This is a woodwind-based symphony. And so Haydn follows that up and uses the idea of solo woodwinds, of the timbre of the wind section, as a unifying force throughout the work. Typically Haydn, a typically classical gambit. So I'm going to play you just the beginning of this slow movement, which is quite lovely, and it has no internal repeats. It's just a beautiful melody for flute and strings. Here it is. Now the Minuet continues the idea of an exploration of woodwind sonority. And in this case, we don't have to play the Minuet. The first section features the oboes and the horns once again. alternating with the strings. And the trio section features the flute and the horns. And so all of the woodwinds play in the minuet. In Haydn's tiny, tiny orchestras, the wind section players were extremely versatile. Probably one of the oboists would have played the flute, or it could even have been that a violinist played the flute. You don't know. Musicians were hired based on their versatility, not so much on their expertise with a single instrument. Brass players generally played all the brass. You had to be able to do as much as possible because that's how you got work. It really was. And so Haydn would have written for his players, or he may have just had a visiting flute player hanging around at the time. So you've got the flute bits and you've got the woodwind bits, and in the finale, Haydn has not forgotten that the rest of the orchestra, that is the string section, also deserves something to do, and the woodwind players, having played 3 exhausting movements, might be a little bit tired, and so the finale is a light, breezy piece, mostly for strings, but the finale is audibly based on the themes and ideas of the first movement. The soft opening has a shape that's very similar to the first theme that we heard originally with the symphony opened, but it's that second subject. Remember that second subject, which by now ought to be burned into your brain. I'm going to play you the second subject from the first movement once again, and then how we hear it in the finale. Only in this case, it's the extended second subject. Remember I said it was just sustained horns, or sustained notes, with a 4-note ostinato underneath it? Well, after that, there's a sort of answer, which is a quick little phrase. It's repeated 4 times. Well, this version of it, in the finale, it's a version of it. It's clearly based on it. I'm going to play you the 2 of them side by side. You'll hear exactly what I mean. The only thing you need to know is that in the finale, it goes at double speed, as it does in the development of the first movement. So this finale second subject is a sort of amalgam of all the versions of the second subject that we hear in the first movement. Here it is. I think the derivation should be quite clear, is it not? And with that, you have all that you need to listen to the entire finale straight through, without repeats, a fabulous summation of what has unquestionably been one of the most fascinating and fabulous symphonies we've heard so far. Oh, who am I kidding? They're all fascinating and fabulous. Really. Here's the finale. And that, my friends, is an incredible, incredible symphony. And, one of the things, the sort of the sad things, I think, in our approach to listening to the classics is that when we learn about classical music and classical forms, it's always customary to take the last pieces that a composer does, because those theoretically represent the most mature, sophisticated, and they are. They are in their way. But to ignore these early Haydn symphonies is a huge, huge mistake. Because first of all, they're not immature at all, but also because Haydn was in some ways more experimental in his early music than he was in his later music, simply because he'd acquired the mastery in his later stuff. In his later stuff, he knows so well exactly what he's doing and how to do it that he doesn't have to try things out. But in these earlier works, he's learning his craft. He's experimenting. He's seeing what he can do. He's enlarging the language of music. And for that reason, they're particularly interesting and particularly valuable as a way to learn and understand what the possibilities are inherent in the musical materials that Haydn is working with. Because this is where he says, oh, let me try this one here and that one there. Later on, he's going to put it all together and combine them all. And it's harder to disentangle the individual elements. But in these earlier ones, they're highlighted. And so you could focus on individual elements, I think, a lot more easily. And nowhere more so than in Symphony number 24. So thank you so much for joining me on this thrill ride, the Haydn Symphony Crusade. Keep on listening, folks. See you in number 25.